This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. Hi guys, I'm here with a video showing you how I created the sword for my Raven Branwen cosplay from RWBY. These patterns are available on my store, Envy, and Etsy. So first things first, once I figured out the pattern and got that down, I transferred that to EVA Foam. The foam I'm using to make the sheath is 6mm, and the foam I'm using to make the sword is also 6mm. Since this foam is not flat on both sides and one side is textured, I have to make sure that I'm flipping over my patterns when making the second piece, since I need them to be back to back and be the same shape, because I'm layering it up. It's got to match, got to line up, and I don't want the sides showing to have the texture on it. So if your foam is like mine, just be aware of that when you are tracing out your patterns. Once all of the pieces are traced out, I go ahead and cut them out using a pair of scissors. Box cutters works as well. Because one side is textured, in order to glue two pieces together anywhere that I need them to be attached, I go ahead and Dremel down the textured edge so that it will adhere better. So for the sword, I'm layering up two pieces of 6mm EVA foam and gluing those together. I wanted to make sure the edges stayed pressed really tightly together, so I Dremeled off the textured part on the inside edge of both. And then I glued the two layers together. One thing I will say that I didn't do and I recommend you doing is adding some sort of dowel, like a wooden dowel, that is the entire length of the sword from like pretty close to the end of the blade to into the handle part, just because that will help it stay sturdy. Without it, I found that the sword was really floppy and ended up bending and being a lot more flimsy than I wanted it to be. So if I was to do this again, I would go back in and Dremel out a small section on either side of the inside of the blade pieces and stick in a wooden dowel and have enough left over sticking out that it could go into the handle piece, so that it would be like one solid sturdy piece. I should also note that I'm using contact cement to glue everything together. Once the two pieces were glued together, I took a pair of scissors and cut at an angle along the edge that's going to end up being beveled and be the sharp edge of the blade. And I'm just using the scissors to cut away a majority of the foam so that it's easier to sand later. And then I move on to gluing the sheath together. And for that, I just applied glue just around the edges and only around the edges, because I did need the sword to eventually be able to go into the sheath. So make sure you leave that top edge of the sheath open, because that's the top and that's where the sword's going to go in and out of. And then I'm gluing some more things together, like the handle and some other detailed piece for the sheath. If you have access to thicker foam, which is something I did not have at the time, you can totally skip this step and just use the thicker foam instead. Something between 10 and 12mm is probably ideal. Then I took a heat gun and heated the sheath into the shape that I needed it to be. So one thing to note first is those lines that I drew onto the sheath, those decorative lines, I scored those with a box cutter, and when I'm heating this with the heat gun to open up it more and shape it better, it's also opening up those lines and creating grooves or indentations into the foam, which is what I needed to be done. So I'm knocking out 2 birds with 1 stone here. The other reason I'm using the heat gun was to shape it to fit around the sword so that the sword could fit in it and it would stay open, because once I primed it, it wouldn't be very flexible anymore. So I needed it to keep that shape and hold that shape before I did any of that, which is what it will do after it totally cools down, and I leave the sword blade in the sheath until it cools so that it will cool holding that shape. Okay, now onto what I'm actually doing in this clip. So what I'm doing here is I'm just creating more of those pieces that are on the sheath, like those 3-dimensional pieces that pop off of it, like what you see me doing here. And all of this was made from 2mm EVA foam. So all the colorful foam that you'll see in the video, or the white foam in the video, that's all 2mm EVA foam. That's the thinner foam, and I only needed it to be thin because it's just decorative pieces and they didn't need to be really bulky or anything like that. For this, I used a reference photo to help me stay on track of what attaches to what and how the end result should look. Taking a break from gluing, I'm moving on to dremeling or sanding down the foam sword. So for this, I'm sanding down all of the edges so that they're nice and smooth, but then when it comes to the side that needs to be like the sharp side of the blade, I'm beveling that on both sides at an angle so that it looks like a sword blade. I do have a video on how to do bevels if you have no idea where to even start or begin, and this is like your first time cosplaying. I have a video all about that for you. I'm also taking a smaller Dremel head and one that comes to a point to Dremel in some more details on the sword and the sword's sheath. I'm also just sanding down the edges for all of the pieces so that everything is nice and smooth. So I sanded down the edges for the handle, for that weird oval rectangular piece that we were working on earlier, made from 2mm EVA foam that you see in the background right there, and then for the edges for the sheath. So for that 2mm EVA foam piece, I figured out where I liked the placement on one side, measured that, and then copied that over to the other side just so that they would be totally even on both sides and line up with one another. And then I'm taking contact cement and gluing those pieces on, as well as the handle. Although I think I actually skipped gluing on the 2mm EVA foam pieces for a bit to work on the sword more, so that's not until a later clip. Here I'm working on the sword again, and I'm gluing together that part of the sword that sits at the bottom of the handle and the top of the blade. I don't know sword anatomy, so I don't know what it's called, but when you see it come together, you'll understand what I'm talking about.
Take it easy, there's no need to scream and shout. As far as I can see, now think it's time for you to leave in peace now. As far as I can see, now think it's time for you to leave in peace now. Peace now. In peace now. In peace now. In peace now.
Once all the edges for that piece were glued together, I needed to cover the top and bottom part, so I used 2mm EVA foam to do this, and when it came to the top part, because it's such a funny shape, I just applied glue over a giant slab of excess foam and around the top edges and stuck that on, pressing it down as I went along, and then cut off any excess around the edges. I also cut a rectangle-shaped hole in the middle that could fit around the blade's handle. And then I actually patterned out the bottom piece and cut that out and glued that on. The bottom piece could actually be patterned out because it was a nice flat shape that was easy to trace around. To get those holes the right size, I just traced around the top of the handle. After cutting off any excess, I took my Dremel and smoothed out those edges so that the seams were nice and clean looking. Then I slid that part into place on the sword and glued it down. And now I started working on some more details. And a lot of these were just kind of winged and not really patterned or planned. I just cut out large rectangular pieces to create the small details that are on the sword. Like this part that sits just below the handle where the sword's a bit wider at one edge and has some cutout details that we'll get to later. But for that, I took a rectangular cut of 2mm EVA foam and glued that around the blade and then cut off the excess and dremeled down that seam line, making it a little bit more flat. To add some more dimension to the top of the handle, since that small indented part at the very top there that you see where I cut out those two shapes in the rectangle, that is supposed to be more indented than the rest, but I didn't really want to take away any more foam, so instead I'm adding foam to the top and bottom part of the handle. Instead, again, I'm using 2mm EVA foam, and I'm just taking large rectangular slabs that I'm holding up to the piece, cutting off any excess so that it's the right height, and then gluing it on, and again cutting off any excess around the edges.
Seat you by the fire. Listen, listen. There's something I must confide. I know I said that it'd be fine. I know I made it look like it'd be alright, but I think I learned my lesson, and I'm not gonna let get you out of my sight. You can call me killer, 'cause I'll bring you to the light. And it might taste bitter when you're answering to God. You can call me killer as you look into my eyes. Nothing but us.
I'm also drawing out some of the details that are on that green foam that we just placed around the top of the sword's blade with a marker, and then I'm taking a box cutter to score it and a heat gun to open up those lines so that there's nice indented grooves or details there. Now I'm gluing on those weird oval rectangular pieces from earlier that I said I was gluing on earlier, but I actually paused and didn't glue on until now. There's this weird egg-shaped or half egg-shaped bolt at the bottom of her sword. So to create that, I glued 2 layers of 6mm EVA foam together that are small circular shapes, and then dremeled that into a rounded cone or half egg shape. And then I glued it into place using contact cement.
You can call me killer, 'cause I'll bring you to the light. And it might taste bitter when you're answering to God. You can call me killer as you look into my eyes. Nothing but a sinner.
Now that everything was sanded down and glued together, it was time to start the priming process. I primed everything with about 5 layers of wood glue. This took quite some time. Another thing I made to be sure of was to scoop out any excess glue that got into the grooves and the indentations, because that is bound to happen. It's kind of gloopy and watering, and it's going to sink into those cracks, and I didn't want those to get filled and end up being even or smooth with the rest of the things and just kind of get lost or disappeared. So I made sure to go back in and just took like a little tool, like a toothpick works, and kind of scoop out any excess glue that got into those grooves. Once the priming was done, it was time to start painting. I started off by spray painting the blade red and then masking that off with tape and paper so that I could spray paint the rest of the blade a dark gray as well as the sheath. And then I unwrapped all that paper because I didn't really need it to cover up anything anymore. And I needed to be able to work on the blade again in a little bit.
Trust me,
I took some acrylic paint to paint in some of the other details, like she has these light gray pieces on the sheath, so that's what I'm painting on here. I did a couple layers of the acrylic paint and then topped that off with a coat of clear glossy spray paint before moving on to the shading. To shade the prop, I'm using oil paint and a couple different paintbrushes so that I can blend that out and smear that out and make it look a lot more like a natural shadow. To figure out where I want to place these shadows, I just kind of pick spots that I think will look good, usually anywhere there's a groove or indentation, and around any of the three-dimensional pieces or pieces that need to have like a bit of separation from the rest of the prop to them, and in any areas where there's just like a shadow would fall there. You can kind of tell when you like look at things, you'll start getting like an eye for this and be like, oh, a shadow would look good here and a shadow would probably fall here in real life, so let me just kind of accentuate that. And I do the same thing for the sword. I took 3 different colors of EVA foam. I didn't paint these or anything. These are the colors that the foam came in. They're 2mm pieces of the EVA foam each, and I cut them into squares that are going to fit in between these 2 pieces that you see me applying the glue in here, the 2 oval half circle pieces, like the long half circle oval rectangular piece that's really weird shaped, and then the small top piece. I waited until I was finished doing everything to put these details in because I knew they would be too hard to paint later and I didn't really want to have to bother with that. So I just waited until the last part and used colorful foam to add these details into the sheath. I went back in because I did miss like a part and added a dark gray coloring to a section of the sheath to match the reference photo that I was looking at better. And then I topped everything off with one final coat of clear glossy spray paint, and that finishes up this prop. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Thanks for watching. I will be back with more tutorials, and I have plenty more I've already posted, so be sure to check that out and stick around. Thanks for watching, have a lovely day, and bye!